In 1968, the world was on fire with rebellion and change, and in Czechoslovakia, the Prague Spring became one of the most significant moments of the Cold War. It all started with Alexander Dubček. On January 5, 1968, he became the first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. This was a surprising choice, given the country's deep alignment with the Soviet Union. But Dubček had a vision for socialism with a human face. Reforms that would bring more freedom to the people and loosen Soviet control. Dubček's action program aimed to decentralize the economy, relax censorship, and increase democratic participation. Newspapers began to criticize the government openly. Students organized protests, and intellectuals debated the future of the country. For the first time in years, the people of Czechoslovakia felt a sense of hope and freedom. But all of this was deeply unsettling to the Soviet Union. The Kremlin saw the reforms as a threat to their control over Eastern Europe. If Czechoslovakia could make these changes, what would stop other Soviet satellite states from following suit? At first, the Soviet Union tried diplomacy. Brezhnev met with Dubček multiple times, insisting the reforms be rolled back. But Dubček resisted, confident in Czechoslovakia's right to chart its own path. In July 1968, the Warsaw-pact countries, Bulgaria, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union, issued a warning. The Warsaw Letter made it clear that while they respected the sovereignty of socialist nations, they would not tolerate any threat to the socialist system. Czechoslovakia, they implied, was going too far. By summer, the energy in Czechoslovakia was electric. The people felt liberated as the press pushed boundaries, and citizens expressed long-suppressed frustrations with the Soviet system. But this brief period of freedom came to a devastating end. On the night of August 20th, 1968, Soviet tanks and troops, joined by forces from other Warsaw Pact nations, invaded Czechoslovakia. Over 200,000 soldiers and thousands of tanks flooded the streets. The invasion was swift and brutal. Czechoslovakians resisted in any way they could, from erecting barricades to passive protests. Radio stations broadcast calls for calm and non-violent resistance, and citizens stood in front of tanks, risking their lives. But resistance against such overwhelming military power could only last so long. Dubček and other leaders were arrested and taken to Moscow. Under immense pressure, Dubček agreed to reverse many of his reforms. The free press was shut down, censorship was reinstated, and the brief period of political freedom was crushed. But the invasion couldn't fully extinguish the spirit of the Prague Spring. Internationally, the world watched in shock. Western countries condemned the invasion, but the geopolitical realities of the Cold War prevented any real action. Diplomacy, not intervention, was the response. The Prague Spring didn't last, but its legacy endured. The seeds of resistance had been planted. Czechoslovakia returned to the Soviet fold, but the cracks in the communist system were widening. The Brezhnev Doctrine, which came out of the invasion, cemented the Soviet Union's policy to intervene in any socialist state where communism was under threat, casting a long shadow over Eastern Europe. And while Dubček's dream was crushed in 1968, the Prague Spring inspired future generations. 21 years later, in 1989, the Velvet Revolution peacefully ended communist rule in Czechoslovakia, fulfilling the aspirations of the Prague Spring. The Prague Spring also highlighted a key truth. Even in the face of overwhelming force, people will always strive for freedom. Czechoslovakia may have been subdued, but the memory of that brief period of hope never truly died. In the end, the Prague Spring was more than just a failed reform movement. It was a beacon of resistance against authoritarianism, a moment in history that showed the world that freedom, once tasted, can never be fully suppressed.